My name is Matt Liebman. I am with Jewish Climate Action Network Steering Committee, and I want to welcome you all to today's presentation. It's a webinar slash discussion on Let's Talk Electricity Rates with Harvey Michaels. And we organized this webinar because we've been talking a lot about electricity rates within the JCAN. If we have a clean energy future, we're going to have to decarbonize and use electricity more and more for powering our heat pumps, for community solar, for electric vehicles. And for homeowners to invest in those technologies, we need to reduce a barrier, which is high electricity rates. So we're going to discuss this, and we have Harvey Michaels from MIT doing that. But before that, I'm going to introduce Fred Davis, who is the president of JCAN, who will then introduce Mark, who will then introduce Harvey Michaels. Without further ado, let me hand it over to Fred.
Okay, Matt, thanks so much. And thanks everybody for being here. Matt, Thea, and everyone else involved in putting this program together. Really appreciate it. So I want to emphasize that JCAN, Jewish Climate Action Network, is an action-oriented organization. I want to mention that after tonight, we're going to have a series of programming that's a little different than a webinar-based. And I want to introduce that announcement by mentioning national elections. People may have noticed national elections in the news. One I wanted to mention happened in the UK some weeks ago, and it turns out a lot of people came out to vote. And as a result, Green parties and Green agenda in general did well. That was one. Number two, people may have heard France had an election a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of people came out to vote, a whole lot. And guess what? Green parties, Green agenda did well. And what am I leading up to? This country, the United States of America, is going to have a national election in November. You all know this. And what is needed for climate is for a lot of people to come out and vote. So we are going to be doing a lot of programming with the Environmental Voter Project. Some of you have already done that in this cycle, this election cycle, or previous election cycles with JCAN. This election needs a lot of people to vote. Okay, thank you very much. And I will now turn it over to Mark. Thank you, folks.
Anyway, my name is Mark Dyan.
We can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you were a little low before, but now you're good.
Muffled. Okay. I live in Newton. I've been working on energy issues pretty much since 1974. I've bumped into Harvey Michaels a couple of times in the course of that. The initial campaign I worked on was trying to make electric rates flat. Harvey was on the other side of that issue, but we got along pretty well then. And Harvey was an MIT graduate who went on from working in the Dukakis administration to found several energy efficiency companies focusing on time of use, peak load work. I worked on sort of the other side of the aisle working on energy efficiency as well. And again, we kept bumping into one another until we ended up on the board of directors of the company that I was working for, along with a couple of other luminaries, oddly enough, including the guy who's the current governor of Connecticut. And we worked on energy policy together. And Harvey has gotten himself back in, or sort of stayed in touch with academic side. He's now working at MIT's Sloan Sustainability Program, working on a whole variety of issues. And we work together on some energy policy things as well. This year, the Massachusetts legislature is taking on the third major energy bill that they've taken on in the past two sessions. And it's a bill that deals with the siting and permitting of renewable energy and expansion of the grid. It's dealing with a big expansion of EV charging. It's on the Senate side anyway. It's dealing with the gas companies and how to get them to be promoting clean energy and non-gas alternatives to the fuel they now provide. And what it is not touching at all is electric rates, because the legislature, I think, thinks it's too complicated, which is why we're fortunate tonight to have Harvey Michaels explain it to us so that we can get ahead of the Massachusetts legislature and understand a complex topic that will probably be the center of political debate and policy debate over the next several years. So without further, I mean, when I'm looking at complicated energy policy issues, I generally call Harvey and ask him to explain it to me. And today we have a large, he's speaking to a larger group of us, and I think it'll be both highly informative and entertaining, and I believe it'll have policy implications, as I say, for the future of the Commonwealth. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Michaels, and he can explain to us how the electric rates work and perhaps why the legislature is so shy about doing anything about them.
Thank you, Mark and Matt and Fred and JCAN. And I really appreciate the chance to chat with you some about this topic. I am, as Mark said, a energy efficiency career person going back a long way, and dealt with public policy side as well as the very early stages of building the industry, being part of a company that I led at one point, starting another company in the space, and then having about 15-year stint now at MIT. And it's really nice at MIT that we get a chance to look at things a little more broadly, but I continue to connect with the policy communities and the state and federal government, cities, and groups like the JCAN Legs and Regs Committee, which I really enjoy and I recommend if any of you are interested, and synagogue groups like Temple Shir Tikva, Temple Israel at times, and it's really great that we're all engaging in this. So the topic I was given tonight was to talk about electricity prices and rates. They are high, and we're hitting the summer season when generally our use goes up because we air condition. And as a result, it seemed like a good time to do this. But a lot of things are going on associated with the grid. And those things have implications for very important questions, such as whether or not it will make sense financially for us to put in heat pumps and electric vehicles and own electric vehicles. And that's a problem in its own right, but it's also a problem because we don't have a solution to climate change that doesn't involve the majority of people doing that. We also have a power grid that we're very concerned about. You may have read things in the newspaper that the power grid is forecasting some big problems with new loads, and utilities are proposing billions of dollars of investment in the power grid. And that, of course, if left unchecked, would make electricity even more expensive. So that's what I'd like to talk about. What I'd like to do is give a little bit of an introduction, put a little more on the setting and a summary of some things, and then ask any of you who would like to identify yourselves to go ahead and do so. And if there's something that's particularly on your mind, to let me know what it is. And then we'll go in deeper in some of the other areas. So we're discussing electricity prices, I think, for a few reasons. One that pretty much all agree, government interveners, utilities even, that today's prices are very high here and a burden, and tomorrow's projected prices are even more so. Typical Massachusetts electric price today is about twice the national average. We pay about 33 cents a kilowatt hour. The national average, the median, is about 17 cents. So today, a lot of Massachusetts homes have an electric bill of $250 to $300. That varies from season to season. We're hitting the air conditioning and season, and some people will have even more than that. And that's a big bill, and applied to the 2.5 million households in Massachusetts. It's a substantial burden to the economy. And it's particularly a burden in justice communities because many of those areas have just as high bills. and it's pretty challenging to pay that much. Beyond that, large future electricity price increases are expected and forecasted. And it's forecasted more than anything else because of the power demand growth on the grid associated with buying all those heat pumps instead of using our gas or oil heat, and electric vehicles rather than using our gasoline vehicles. And this is called electrification. But we need electrification, and with these high prices, it will be a challenge to get the scale we need. We need the electrification to address climate change. Tikkun Olam, we can't do that without electrification. And it will be a challenge unless we get the prices to a point where it makes strong financial sense. There's a real reason to run towards these things for the financial benefit. It'll be really hard to get enough people electrifying to make a big enough difference. Some think, well, we can do the right thing and do what's right and choose to electrify our homes and our vehicles, even if there are price challenges. And perhaps, but most studies suggest 20 to 30% will do that. It'll be really hard to get the amount of the population we need to do this to step forward if there's that price barrier. But it's a real possibility, and I'm going to try to bring us to understanding this tonight. It's a nuanced issue that people who live in the biz, a lot of them don't understand it. It's a real possibility that we can electrify and at the same time make future electric prices lower. I'd like to see if I can describe that tonight, and we can think about how maybe we can press things forward so they go in that direction. Okay, so this is sort of introducing myself, and it's really introducing Mark Dian and Fred Davis and anyone else who happens to be in the business. We've been part of the field for the 70s, and over that time, something pretty interesting has happened. This is nationally. We've bent the curve on energy use growth, this particularly the electric industry, so that it's really stopped growing. Something has happened so that the growth that we always anticipated has gotten slower. And at the same time, the fuels we use for electricity have changed. You can see that coal used to be the big one, and it's really tailing off nationally. In New England, it's almost gone. Natural gas has actually grown in the era of fracking. Nuclear got big and it stayed the same bigness. There have been no new plants in 30 years. Renewables is coming along. We've always had hydropower, Niagara Falls and the like, but now we have so much more in solar and wind. And this is a pretty exciting outcome. It's also particularly exciting when you realize that we always thought when the economy grew, energy use and electric load grew as well. That red line is where the economy has grown over the years. And you can see 1980, 1990, we really broke the pattern, and the economy has been growing and electric growth has not. I call this energy management. It's the broader term for energy efficiency. It includes solar in our homes and batteries and smart buildings. I'm also in the Sloan School of Management at MIT, and it's a good term for what I teach. So I use that to more broadly describe energy management. So over these years, what problem have we been trying to solve, us energy management folks? Over time, the answer has changed. In the 70s, when I got into it, there was an energy crisis, and there were gas lines, and prices went up fourfold. And the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries pushed up the prices initially as a strategic approach, but ultimately it was a weapon. And this happened in the 70s and really spurred us to get into building energy efficiency and started driving us towards advances in tech and policies. We came up with great things. We came up with windows that only had 1/5 to 1/10 the heat loss of old windows. We came up with light bulbs that are a total miracle, LED bulbs. They run for 8 nights on the electricity of 1 night, all year round. And these things have made a huge difference in having an impact on that curve. In the 1980s and 1990s, we got into a new approach to managing our energy involving utilities. And it was called the soft energy path. Rather than utilities building new plants, they looked at what energy efficiency could do to displace the need for new plants. And this was called integrated resource planning. It was a great thing to get involved in. There was a lot of very interesting work done to establish the principles for integrated resource planning. But over the years, programs like MassSave and others in other states have done a great deal to bend that curve down from a couple percent a year of growth to flat to down. And then we got into the age in the early 2000s of the internet and photovoltaics and electronics. And we had smart and clean energy coming in. We started building that in to our strategies: site solar, batteries, EVs, and smart buildings. And these are some of the companies that I've connected with that have been involved in that. And it's been pretty exciting. But now we're really in Act 4, which is realizing the most major purpose for this, sort of the highest purpose for all of this today, is the climate emergency that we face. On the building side, that's not the entirety of the problem, but it's an important part of it. It's about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. If we didn't do anything, the greenhouse gases would double by 2050. And the only solution that we can find is for all buildings and transportation to electrify by 2050. So time is short. We've targeted 1.5 C centigrade as really where we need the heat increase to stop, and we're very close to 1.5 C now. The time is short, but there are ways to either stick to 1.5 C or, if necessary, we go be higher than 1.5 C to come down to that level of climate change and keep the climate manageable. These pictures are of an application called En-ROADS we've developed at MIT. That's John Sturman, who's the head of the system dynamics group that I'm part of. And we take this to policymakers. The picture on the left is at a climate conference in Madrid, a COP conference, COP25, a few years ago. Okay, so that's kind of the climate situation. But meanwhile, we have another layer that's important to our discussion tonight. In the 1990s, New England created a competitive electricity market, one of the first. And we went from utilities, both building the power plants, to running the distribution wires, to selling the electricity, to utilities only doing the downstream part, and the market providing the power that the grid serves up to us. So this is a picture of ISO New England, the grid operator in New England's load as of 1:30 today. And it shows in each of the 6 New England states what electricity costs on the spot market right then. The prices where you see like $30.86. These are in dollars per megawatt hour. That's 1,000 kilowatt hours. So it translates down to about 3 cents a kilowatt hour. It costs 3 cents a kilowatt hour today to buy wholesale electricity. That's pretty cheap compared to 33 cents, which is what we're all paying. So there's 30 cents of margin right now because there are no other costs really directly associated with buying 1 more kilowatt hour from your utility today, other than this 3 cents. The picture on the right was what the power plants were on the New England grid at that time at about 1:30 today. And you can see that about 2/3 of the power came from natural gas. Unfortunately, we're not at the point where we're mostly renewables yet. Renewables, 9%, hydro, 4%. Nuclear, if you consider that a non-carbon emitting fuel, 22%, but 2/3 of it was natural gas today. That means at the margin, if you used more or a little less, the thing that would change would be the natural gas. And that's important to remember. Now, this is a little bit complicated. I'm going to run through it quickly, but I can come back to it after the opening section if you'd like to discuss it some more. This is an interesting graph. It's called a load duration curve. It has on the left the amount of megawatts of load at any point in time in New England as a whole. And 29,000 megawatts on the top, that's the same as 29 gigawatts, which is about 29 nuclear plants, or twice that many in coal plants. That's what that number means. Our peak in New England is about that. The highest peak we've ever had is around 30 gigawatts. And that's what the left axis says. What they did on this chart, it's very valuable, is they took all the hours in a year and they sorted them. So these aren't the hours in a year in order from January to December. These are the hours in the year sorted from the highest use hour to the lowest use hour of the entire year. So put the highest use hour on the left and the lowest use hour on the right. It's called the load duration curve. So what's interesting is you could see the pattern of use, and you see the shape on the left where it kind of curves up. That's really where we have a problem. The average price I showed you today, it was right around 3 cents. It's actually been trending pretty well lately, but an average overall is it clears at about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Not much compared to the 33 cents we pay. There's a few hours a year towards the top where 50 cents a kilowatt hour is not unusual. There's occasionally an hour that's $5 a kilowatt hour. And this doesn't happen very often, and particularly New England has done some things so that it doesn't happen very often. In Texas, they don't do the things that New England does to prevent real problems on the grid. So they actually had a whole week of $9 a kilowatt hour in 2021 when it got a little unusually cold. And that crushed some people who were actually exposed directly to the market. But then there are a lot of hours that are really in the empty seats. They are basically coming along. They offer electricity when there's not much going on. This can be, middle of the night on many days. But it even happens sometimes in the middle of the day when we got a lot of solar cooking and the grid's doing very well. We get prices like this. We actually even sometimes get negative prices. So this is what happens on our power grid. The important thing is that we pay 33 cents, and 33 cents is a problem. This is what it costs the person, the company that sells the electricity to us. And the solution involves making some changes there. So the future of the New England power grid is really something that's in the news. And it's important for us to think about it and not accept what the future of the New England power grid is described as now. The New England power grid, so far, the grid peak of all time, power draw, was a long time ago. It was in the summer of 2006 and the winter of 2004. It's been 20 years since we've had a winter peak, 18 years since we've had a summer peak. But ISO New England's projecting that by 2050, we're going to need double those numbers from 20 years ago. So we have to double the size of the power plants, the transmission wires, the substations, the transformers, and even the circuit breaker box in your house so that we'll be able to handle all the heat pumps and EVs. And that's a huge expense. Otherwise, what the data shows us, the electric system annual peaks would continue to fall if not for heat pumps and EVs. I'll go over the chart on the bottom some more, but very briefly, what you're seeing is the summer and winter in 2035, 2040, and 2050. The hashed area on the bottom, the summer and the winter, that's basically most of the electricity we use. The solid orange is air conditioning. The solid blue is heating. And you see that the solid orange stays about the same. It's the blue that gets really big. And then on top of that, we have EVs in the light blue. And that's essentially the issue, because 28 gigawatts, this all-time peak from 2006 is this orange line over here. 23 gigawatts is the all-time winter peak. They're projecting in 2050 all the way up here, 57 gigawatts. And they're saying, we got to get going. We got to build for that right now. And we're also greening the grid, as we must. So even if we weren't growing, it's great that we're adding solar and offshore wind on top of onshore wind and batteries, so that the carbon emissions associated with using a kilowatt hour continue to drop. So the outline of what I'd like to talk about from now is to go in a little more depth on electric prices and electrification in the grid, the plan today, and the potential heat pump and EV impacts, and think a little bit about other ways, so that rather than doing it the way that ICE in New England has laid out, perhaps we can essentially try to move some of the load from this peak time over to what I call the empty seats on the grid, the time when there's plenty of capacity and there's not very many customers. And if we can move some of it over there, that's how we can make electricity cheaper. And the second part of it that I'd like to get to, so we have time and you're interested, is that we can talk about the opportunities today. Maybe you're out in the market looking for a heat pump, or you're thinking of buying an EV, as I'm in the market right now, or you're thinking about rate options. You're still considering retail rate options that are being offered. You're thinking about some of those. Happy to discuss those. And then, as Fred described, it's a Jewish climate action. And we're looking to see what kind of actions maybe it makes sense for us to put some focus on. Maybe think about some special rates, incentives, legislation, requirements that we want to get behind. So that's sort of my opening layout of all this. Let me ask you, if anyone's interested in identifying themselves, want to say very briefly, if you have you're in the biz, or particularly if you're a utility or government associated with this, and certainly if there's something in this area that you find pretty interesting and is particularly on your mind, let me know.
Go ahead, Robert.
Good evening, Harvey. I got to say that was the clearest explanation of any energy-related chart I've seen for quite a while. And I think, as you know, you see a lot of poorly explained charts at a lot of conferences. So that was really great. So besides being a fellow Temple Israel member, I run a company called Imbue that does some of the kinds of stuff that Harvey was talking about, specifically in the multifamily industry and primarily in affordable housing. And I'm really interested to hear more about, variable electricity rates and moving load around. And we're trying to help our customers do that. But I'm really interested in how the utilities are responding to this, and how, the various other, the utility commission and so forth, because at some level it seems really straightforward. And I'm still learning how long it takes to get these kinds of policy changes.
Yes. Hi, Harvey. How are you?
Hi.
Thanks for being with MIT. We use Climate Interactive. And as you know, training is available. I just wanted to let everybody know that Interactive, the Climate America Rewiring, will give you a lot of good information, which I put in the chat, about how we're going to progress and people how to buy EVs, heat pumps, and the percentage they have to buy each year in order for us to meet our climate goals. And you can find that on the internet. It'll give you a lot of good information.
Thank you, Rothbard.
You're welcome.
Walter?
All right. Hi, I'm Walter Hubbard from Winchester. And my question is, so our rate is 33 cents a kilowatt hour, and supply is only about half of that. 16 cents a kilowatt hour. How does transmission and distribution get to take up the other 17 cents a kilowatt hour, where that's the amount that other states pay for their total? So how does that portion of the bill get to be so high, and how can we bring it down?
Yeah, the why so high. I'll say what I know, but there are some questions there. In this state, by the way, the 40 municipal electrics, which are in 51 of our 350 cities and towns, are paying on average 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's not only way far away that people are paying less.
Okay, so how do we get the distribution and transmission down from 16, 17 cents a kilowatt hour down to something more reasonable?
Yeah, so let's get to that. Let's get to that, and it'll come up a few times. Janet?
You're going to talk about community aggregation, I assume?
Yeah. Community Choice Act. Sure. Anybody else? Anybody want to say hello?
Harvey, there's a couple of questions coming in on the chat. And then we'll probably have to move on because as a time check, it's 7:40. Some of the questions are, how do smart meters change the price to reflect demand? And in fact, that's another question. Could local mini grids provide a solution? So those are some of the questions that are coming in on the chat. So I think we should probably move on to the next section of your presentation.
Okay, let's do it.
Thank you, everybody, for your questions. And he's going to respond right now.
Okay, so electric bills. I suppose that most of you have looked at an electric bill. I was just going to point a few things out very quickly. One is electric bills vary. There are a lot of 250 to 300 bills over the course of a year. In the more modest seasons, of course, it depends on what you use electricity for. Some of the bills are higher because they have more household uses of electricity. Other ones may be using gas for hot water or gas for their clothes dryers, and some are using electricity. Air conditioning is certainly a big one. Where we are in Massachusetts today is 85% of homes, 85 to 90% of homes are pretty heavily air conditioned. Maybe not 100% air conditioned, but mostly air conditioned. And this is kind of remarkable because only a third of homes actually have central air conditioning. The rest of homes have a lot of window units. But people have gotten enough of those in over the years that they're effectively using as much electricity as if they were centrally air conditioned. That's a big enough percentage that the total amount we use for air conditioning has actually stopped going up. Hopefully the other 10 to 15% of the public gets air conditioning because it's something that's really important for health, particularly in our increasingly warm days of the summer. But that's the kind of circumstances that create higher bills. And it's generally something like 600 kilowatt hours. It's a basic bill, maybe 900 kilowatt hours in a peak summer bill. Two major parts. Here's a picture from an electric bill. It has the supply part and the delivery part that were mentioned. The supply price varies. It varies by the utility providing what's called the basic service rate every 6 months. But it's also something which can be substituted by you either with a retailer or your town by a community choice aggregator as the default. You can still go back to the basic service if you don't like those, but those are now trending down. We had a few years where they got very high for a number of reasons, and now they're trending down a bit. And then the second part is the delivery rate, which is 17 to 19 cents per kilowatt hour. And this is a big number. Municipal utilities are much less. If you look on that delivery portion of the bill, if you can see it, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. There's distribution and transmission are the big ones. but there are elements for solar and renewable energy and energy efficiency and a transition charge, which is now negative. It was a cost associated with that restructuring in the 1990s. And you put all those things together and you get the 17 to 19 cents a kilowatt hour, and the two of them sum to 30 to 35 cents a kilowatt hour. The big problem is that you kind of can justify buying a heat pump. You're not going to get hurt a lot buying a heat pump. And if you do it right, you'll economically have a heat pump, particularly if your alternative was oil. And you can buy an electric vehicle and it will look okay. On average, these things break even, but it depends on the details. Sometimes not, sometimes yes. So are rates high? Yes. We're paying a lot more than the national average. Massachusetts municipal utilities are a lot lower than the average rate that Massachusetts people pay. And there are alternatives that people have, like putting solar in their home. And if you did it with a finance purchase power agreement, then you're probably paying something like what you would pay in the Massachusetts municipal utility. That depends on the circumstances. Of course, you can invest in the solar. If you own it, you're paying nothing except for the debt on the system. Are high rates a problem for our climate? Yes, absolutely. Climate solutions require electrification, particularly heat pumps and EVs. Prices are already too high for heat pumps and EVs to scale. We need to get down. We need to get the price that we're paying for electricity down to about 20 cents a kilowatt hour for people to run towards them. That's what we really need people to do, not say, well, okay, I guess I want to act on my climate interests. I want to do the right thing, so I'm going to buy a heat pump or an EV. You have people who basically are saying, you'd be silly not to buy a heat pump or EV. And that's what you'd get at 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So to solve climate, I think we need to get there. The nation is there. Our municipal utilities are there. We ought to be able to figure out how we get the rest of us, particularly for these end uses, at that price. So why are rates so high? We can discuss this some more at the end. There is a urban character that is more expensive to serve, and that has something to do with the higher distribution costs. Most of the municipal utilities are not in central urban areas. We have a use pattern in New England, which is more peaky. So you have a period of time that we use a lot, and a lot of time when we don't really use the grid very much. And these, this is what I call the empty seats, and I'll explain that analogy some more. There are reasons that are probably worthwhile, or at least important, for why the rates are so high. We are very focused on resilience in New England. The power goes out at minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which we had for the better part of the day in February 2023. That is a life and death matter. So we have to do things to make sure that our grid does not fail here, that places in more moderate climates may not need to do. And we do that. We do things that actually make our grid more resilient than, for example, Texas, which, as you hear, is really a total mess. And there are regulatory questions. There may be ways we're doing things that cause costs to be higher, that don't encourage utilities enough to be efficient. There are real questions there. But it's also argued that our rates are high, but our bills are not that high. And what we're talking about there is we've had a lot more energy efficiency in the households in New England than in a lot of other places in the country. So our actual electric use is less here in a lot of ways, other than for heating. If you have electricity or electric vehicles, our electric bills have fewer kilowatt hours, we use less. So our bills are still a little bit higher than the national average, but not that high compared to our rates. So that's the interesting part of the story. I hope that makes sense. So I want to talk a little bit about the grid and the pattern of use and how we can do something about that. Historically, utilities have been doing some things to influence the consumer demand moment to moment. If you looked at a day, historically, we had this air conditioning peak in kind of the late afternoon. That was the main thing they wanted to control. So they did some things to encourage reduced use during these mid to late afternoon hours, essentially until businesses had most of the air conditioning. So they were one of the reasons why the load shape looked the way it was. And there was some pricing to try to encourage that. Now we have a different load shape. The load shape has changed. It's gone down in the middle of the day because of solar. And it's left us with this peak in the evening. And it kind of looks like a duck head. So they call this the duck curve, which I've illustrated this way. And that's the shape of the load in our grid today. Historically, we tried dynamic pricing options. Most of the country was ahead of us in actually installing advanced meter infrastructure, which made it possible for utilities to see hour by hour how much you were using. And many of them tried experiments of giving people time of use options. There was a rate that would vary from one part of the day to be a little higher and the rest of the day lower. It's called TOU, time of use. There were critical peak rates that were generally a time of use rate, with an exception that the day before, on really high load days, they would give you a signal. And then for 4 hours or so, you would pay a much, much higher price of electricity. In this little chart I show, this is from Pacific Gas and Electric in California. Rather than at the time a flat 18 cents a kilowatt hour, now they're 45 cents. So it's kind of an old chart. The time of use rate they tested was about 15 cents up to 20 cents during the peak hours from 2 to 6, but a few days a year, $1.10. That was the signal. The result of the signal was tremendous. The peak loads in Pacific Gas and Electric dropped 20%. You think of that with the New England problem we're having, that would make a huge deal. And now we can do things where we can make settings on more automatically. Our electric vehicles can easily charge off the peak time. And we could do some things to really work with that. So did they keep these experiments after they did them? No, almost all of them were dropped because the people in the experiments said, these things are too complicated. The bill change in aggregate isn't very much. I have better things to do. I don't want to run around my house juggling my loads. So they generally were considered a failure, even though the data suggested in other ways that it was really successful. We have hot, sunny summer days now, and the duck kind of looks a little more detailed like this. You got wind all the time, meaning that the total load we would have had is lower because we have wind. And then we have solar, which pops up in the middle of the day, creating that sort of tummy of the duck area, leaving us with a head of the duck and a morning breakfast tail of the duck. So that's kind of the load shape that we're dealing with now. And if we can figure out how to move the loads around so we don't keep adding to the head of the duck, particularly, we won't have to grow the grid anywhere near as much. The other thing that's changed in New England is, even though we're a summer peaking grid, we have a winter problem. And the winter problem is because we responded to fracking and the cheap natural gas and got rid of our coal plants and got rid of most of our oil plants and switched most of those over to natural gas plants. And a lot of us had oil heated homes, and now we have gas heated homes. And when it's really cold out, we don't have enough gas in these pipes. So the law says homes get the gas, power plants don't. And as a result, we have a whole bunch of power plants that don't have pipeline gas. So as I said, our grid has resilience. ISO New England, the grid operator, came up with a program to essentially pay all those natural gas plants a lot of money to have an alternative when it's extremely cold. And this was those extremely cold days in 2023. On these extremely cold days, they're still running natural gas, but they run natural gas, they store it up in an LNG tank on site, or they switched over to oil. There was even a little bit of coal that came on those days. And so those things got us through that extremely cold weather. Interestingly, we learned something important on February 4th. Hydro-Quebec, which sells us a lot of hydropower, on February 4th had nothing to sell us. It went to zero because they have so much electric heat up there. They had nothing for us. And that's important for us to have learned. So now I showed this chart before, the forecast future of the New England power grid. And we see all of that load. The issue is not so much the use of electricity. The use is higher, but it's not that much higher. The use is essentially concentrated on the head of the duct and the tail of the duct. We wake up in the morning, we turn up our heat. That creates the peak. We come home from work and we plug in our vehicle, and that creates the peak. And that's really the challenge we have. This is another look, also the same forecast, also ice in New England, but it's sorted summer from winter, so maybe it's a little bit easier to see. Our big grid problem is heating electrification, which is the green. The amount that's in the dotted line is the amount over the peak load availability we have today. That's what we're building the grid for. We're building the grid entirely for heat pumps in the years ahead. And what this number says is that we need to double it. So why is the grid not smarter? We saw these prices. We're talking about explosive demand. We have these things which we know how to do with smart homes and batteries and Nest thermostats and vehicle to grid loads, or at least stopping charging our vehicles. How can we make it smarter? How can we promote load flexibility before we spend billions of dollars expanding the grid? That's really the key question. So let's consider the empty seat analogy a little more on that. Is that we once had a regulated airline industry, and the airline industry was required to have enough seats available where everybody wanted to fly. And they charged exactly the same price for every seat on every flight all year long. And so what you had was fleets that were essentially built for the Wednesday before Thanksgiving when everybody wanted to go home, that flew 60% empty the rest of the year. Anyone remember flying around on 60% empty flights, right? So that used to be. The average air travel is much less expensive now because we don't do it that way. But the empty seat analogy gives us a strong solution on the grid side. Maybe we should have a sale on heat pump and EV electricity that's off-peak, that fills the empty seats and essentially makes it possible to grow the amount of heat pumps and EVs we have without expanding the grid so much. So this is what I do. I'm going to slide over this right now. Grid interactive energy management. There's a huge opportunity, new tools. Robert described that his company is doing some things like this. I teach a whole class in this, so we're not going to go very far in it tonight. But Internet of Things, grid services from the utility, smartly connecting the distributed energy resources, bringing homes and appliances together and managing together to create essentially the virtual equivalent of a power plant. These are all things we're learning how to do. So electrification, the power grid, and rates. Electrification is both a risk and an opportunity. The risk is we double down on putting things on the peak, and we double the peak, and that increases our costs. Otherwise, loads are forecast flat to down. The opportunity is flatter load growth. Flatter load growth means lower average rates. So even if we give people a discount to 20 cents, for example, on their heat pumps and EVs, and the electricity at the margin is only costing 3 cents because it's not a peak time, that gives the grid a profit, which it can use to make the rates lower for everybody who doesn't have a heat pump and EV too. So it's actually a very egalitarian solution to give a sale price to off-peak use of heat pumps and EVs. The question is, can we now do something that when they did those experiments, they couldn't do? And I think, yes, what we have with AI-enabled apps and devices gives a potentially good result, a better result than before, and it can make it potentially easy and automatic and painless to respond to prices. So ISO New England agrees. They said we can do something, and they've already given us a forecast that's cut from 57 to 51, as John Brown pointed out to me this morning. And it's basically that we're better with these things. But that's the picture. So I'd like to do some questions that go a little deeper into heat pumps.
Yes, I do, sir. We are messaging IRA, as you know, the Inflation Reduction Act. And included in your example, you're mentioning EVs, heat water pumps. How is that going to impact the lowering of the grid cost if people start buying these particular items, getting the benefits that they will get, tax benefits, et cetera, and rebates? What can we do to move them in that direction?
Well, one of the ideas is to make rates lower and make the incentives lower as well. Incentives are expensive. One of the challenges is that the biggest incentives you get for heat pumps come from the electric utility. And the problem with that is it makes the electric bill higher at the same time we're trying to encourage people to use more electricity. So it kind of makes more sense to do something that lowers the rate and perhaps not focus as much on making the first cost as much lower. So that goes in that direction. But I'd like to go a little further with that towards the end. Anyone else have a question right now? Okay, so let me just step a little bit into heat pumps, and then I'll be ready to open it up some more. I don't know if you all know what a heat pump is. How many of you have heat pumps? Let me just see if with those of you on screen. Whoa. How many of you have air conditioning? You have a heat pump. You have a heat pump too. An air conditioner is a heat pump. A refrigerator is a heat pump. A heat pump is just an air conditioner with a reverse so that it can, instead of taking the heat out of your house and putting it on the outside, it takes the heat out of the outside and puts it in your house. But otherwise, it's exactly the same, sort of like a sponge. Because it's a sponge, it's not actually making the heat. It can break the laws of thermodynamics and be over 100% efficient, and that's called a coefficient of performance. The challenge is to understand that the coefficient of performance changes with temperature. And this is something that is also a little complicated, but I'm going to go quickly because we're already at 8 o'clock and we want to finish by 8:30. The coefficient of performance drops. We have 0 degrees on the left, 70 degrees on the right. The coefficient of performance is a terrific 5 to 6 at mildest temperatures. And it's down in the 2 range at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. That means that the coefficient of performance is 3 times higher at the mildest temperatures than the lowest temperatures. It means that per kilowatt hour, a heat pump will put out 3 times as much heat at the high end than at the low end. Most heating systems don't do that. They're flat. They give you the same amount of heat at any temperature for the same amount of fuel. But heat pumps are different that way because of the way they work. Unfortunately, our house goes the other way. Our heat load increases as it gets colder. So the challenging time is the coldest hours for a heat pump. And typically, the way these are put in is that at around 40 degrees is something that if you have an air conditioning size unit, it will cover it. The new modern heat pumps at about twice the size get down into the teens or so, but often they have a deficit and they make it up with something, maybe electric resistance heat, or maybe your backup heating system. That's what's challenging about heat pumps, is these hours down here, which are head of the duck hours, if you use electricity, are also extremely inefficient from the standpoint as compared to other hours if you have a heat pump. It's particularly inefficient if you use electric resistance backup. So the solutions we work on, and this is something that we've done some research projects in my group on, is we found pathways to clean heat and using heat pumps. And one of them is to make your home much more efficient. If you do that, then the heat pump will ride more easily and it won't really have a deficit at the end. We're hoping to have advanced heat pump technologies that have new refrigerants, better performance, have thermal storage. And we're also looking, if you use a heat pump and you have backup heat, to use these smart things to be able to orchestrate well your heat pump and your backup heat. So use as little as possible, but you offset the need for the grid to grow in order to accommodate your heat pump. With advanced meters and demand response, special heat pump rates, these are things that can help. And finally, my friends at HEAT have developed the arguments and now pilots for community geothermal networks. A big one is going in Framingham. And by using geothermal, which is practical at community scale from the way things look, we no longer have that shape you just saw. We have heat pumps that stay efficient all the way down to very cold. They keep that high efficiency of the mild temperatures and they keep it right to the coldest temperatures. And that's a wonderful solution. So that's sort of the summary of the background information. I'm ready to get on to how we can respond. Does anyone want to ask me another question or two on that before we go to how we can respond?
You talked about the efficiency of heat pumps at heating, but what about the efficiency of cooling? Is it just not so significant because we're not living in 120 or 150 degrees?
You got it. You got it. You know, you think about sort of the midpoint, which you want your thermostat to be at, you know, somewhere around 70 degrees or so. How far is it to 100? And how far is it to 0? It's a lot farther to 0. And that's the reason why this is the reason why heat pumps are the big thing down in Texas, because it's roughly the same distance both ways, right? But here we have this double amount of cold compared to heat. So cold climate heat pumps are actually very good at giving you double amount of cold of cold weather coverage as compared to air conditioning coverage. But we still run out in extremely cold weather, and that's really where the challenge is. Good question.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to just see if anybody has questions on heat pumps and EVs. If you're interested in a heat pump, and I hope you are, there's a lot that can be done with smart selection and design. I did notice some heat pump savvy people like Green or Yuan, and there's definitely ways that you can put a heat pump in and come up with a bill savings. And if you need a heating system, that's a good time to think about it. And if you need an air conditioning system, it's kind of a no-brainer time to think about it, because it doesn't really cost more, particularly for a heat pump, than an air conditioner. What you want to do is get a good one from the standpoint of being a heat pump and properly sized. You may want to consider hybrid. There are 2 programs in Mass Save. There's one for all electric, all winter long. There's another one for hybrid. The hybrid economics are definitely better, particularly if you're using gas heat right now. But they're encouraging, with very large $10,000 incentives, people to go all electric. If your home is efficient enough, you can put in that double-sized heat pump and it will cover all winter long. So home's thermal efficiency, which is also heavily incentivized by Mass Save, should happen at the same time to give you a chance to do that without this disastrously difficult to cover electric resistance backup. So I'll just mention on EVs, the math is pretty much 10 cents a mile, whether you're driving a battery electric vehicle, a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, or a hybrid vehicle. If you're paying $3.50 a gallon and you have 3.5 miles per kilowatt hour range on your EV. There's some range to all of these things, but more or less it's a wash. And so get what you'd like here, and get what you think is right and you prefer. And the only thing you don't want to get is a non-hybrid gas vehicle, because then you'll pay a lot more per mile than you will with one of those three. You save about 40% of the carbon emissions on a hybrid, about 75% of the carbon emissions on a plug-in hybrid, and 100% of the carbon emissions, or at least the local carbon emissions, on a battery electric vehicle. So if that's important to you, then you can make your choice that way. But if you feel more comfortable because you have range anxiety with a plug-in, then by all means, it's still a good thing if you do that. Be aware it's a good time to buy EVs. Prices are good. And on many, you'll get federal incentives, but only with leasing. And depending on what happens, this could go away. So at which point you'll be able to get incentives on a Tesla, but not a lot of other vehicles. And that might explain some things to you. But the federal incentives right now are available on any EV if you lease the car. They're available only as a direct payment if you have a vehicle that has enough battery content and local content to be considered a fully domestic vehicle. Massachusetts pays a nice incentive, $3,500, but only if the vehicle has a manufacturer's list price of $55,000 or less. Okay, rates. There are retailer rates that are focused on electric vehicles. There's a rate from one supplier that will give you free electric vehicle charging from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. every day. I'm probably going to go on that rate. It is a little higher charge the rest of the hours, but as long as you can set your EV to charge during those hours, then it's a really good deal. And there are others that are designed to make heat pumps at least a little bit less expensive for you to use, mainly by giving you a fixed charge that you pay no matter what, and then a marginal price for electricity that's lower. There are also some demand response programs that utilities are offering if you're willing to shed loads or you have a battery and you let them tap it. Not many. They have something where they control your thermostat, give you a few dollars for that. They do have a pretty good program that pays you about $1,000 a year if they can tap electricity out of your battery on peak. So those are some of the things you can do now. And so now I'm going to end with this kind of up there and see what you think with the remaining time we have. Where do you think we ought to consider some focus? Where might it be important to change? Do we want to get the message out? Load flexibility first, essentially fight the grid expansion plans that the utilities in ISO New England have. Say, first do something to fill the empty seats before you start building, essentially, taking my analogy, buying more planes. Figure out a way to stop running around 60% unused, and it's going to be 70% unused by the time we get to 2050 with the plan as it stands. Instead, start figuring out some ways to push the load into the empty seats. We can talk about rates and what we ought to maybe push for there. A mass save program, a special rate for heat pumps and EVs. Should we say retailer rates so that they can innovate more rapidly? Because we're considering getting rid of retailers entirely on the residential sector, but find some way to protect people from retailers who have done some things that are harmful. And then we can talk about mass save, and we can talk about some requirements of things that we're just going to ask all people to do. We've talked about prohibiting electric resistance backup, requiring at some point in 5 or 10 years, all electric heat and EVs without any fossil choices. Those are some of the kind of things that are on the table. So somebody pick it up, pick one of these items and provide a thought, and let's see if we can discuss something here. Okay, Matt, kicking it off.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Harvey. That was really great. I just thought I'd kick off some questions real quick. So you explained a little bit about why electricity rates are very high. Partly it's because our grid sounds to be very resilient. And you've made some suggestions to change the load management. Are there trade-offs? Are there risks to that? What if we do some of these actions? Would our grid be less resilient, for example? How do you evaluate that?
That you have to evaluate it. You clearly have to test things. It's good that we're thoughtful and conservative, but that 57 gigawatt number for 2050 that we're now starting to spend money towards assumes that in 2050, we still haven't taught EVs how to push off when they charge from right when we get home from work. And that's kind of silly because that functionality is built into every EV manufactured today. So you'd think we shouldn't expect this head of the duck time to be a time when people charge their EVs. And we ought to basically ensure that doesn't happen. But if you give an app some encouragement with some price incentive, there's no reason to think it's not going to do a good job. And just meet what you tell it to meet, which is that you want the car charged up and ready to go when you need it. You tell it when you need it charged up, and it will make sure it's charged up. Meanwhile, it can avoid the peak times. So that is not really speculative at all. The things that are speculative is that we can use Siri and Alexa and those kind of things and say, okay, you can manage the devices in my home. And I just want what I want when I want it. I want to be comfortable. I want hot water when I take a shower. I want, my icebox to be doing what it should be doing. I want my car to be charged, and I want to pay as little as possible. That's what AI is made for. But you got to give it a benefit to chase. You got to give it a rate, like a time of use rate or critical peak rate or real-time price rate or demand response program, so that we can see if the AI can actually manage things and bring that peak down. So my sense is you have these rates. The concern that regulators have, that I've heard our regulators, including our current ones, have, is they're going to put these rates out there and somebody's going to get stuck paying more. And people are going to be angry that it's too complicated and they don't want to spend all day juggling the loads themselves because they don't really know how to use Alexa, right? So those are fair concerns. So I think the value is so great to not building 57 gigawatts, doubling the size of our grid when we don't really potentially need any larger grid. It's so great that we ought to basically say, you know what, we'll set up the game so you can't lose. You either pay the price as if we didn't have these new rates, or you pay a lower bill on the new rates. Whichever bill is lower, that's the one you pay. So nobody can get hurt by this.
Eric has a question.
Yes, so the argument goes that utilities won't get enough money that way, but I'm pretty sure that's not true.
Thank you, Harvey. And as you referred to, I'm with Greener U, and we helped decarbonize Temple Shear Tikva with heat pumps, which was a great move on their part. And to me, I agree that let's just say you had a factory and then you had double the demand for your product. You wouldn't build a new factory, you'd run a night shift. And I just think we need to use the batteries for everybody's car as that resource that we're investing in, that people have invested in, and use that. Most people don't drive 200 miles or whatever the
range
tank holds or battery holds. You might drive 5, 10, maybe 20 or 30 miles. So you've got plenty of extra electricity in the tank. So that's the big one that I see. And I think I heard recently about in Vermont, the school system. So now you've got big batteries on electrified buses, where the utility bought the battery and the school systems bought the bus. And, basically the utility uses the battery when it needs it. And, school buses sit around a lot of times. So anyway, that's my comment. And then my question, if I have one, is what number do we put into our calculations for people's projects on the future of electricity versus gas prices? Ha ha ha. We wish we knew, right? On a more practical level, we have a 1,000-unit new development that we may be consulting with in Sonoma County, and I want to build this stuff right into it from day one. It's basically a brand new community, and I want to make sure that vehicles are used, you know, whether it's a pilot program, I don't know who's doing it, but we want to do all of this stuff for this community. So anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I just hope we could figure out a way to make that number 20 cents. Because it could be a special rate to start with for controlled heat pumps and EVs, but again, electricity gets cheaper for everyone if you start having a grid that's more evenly loaded through the day, rather than one that, as planned for 2050 right now, is 70% underutilized. So if in fact we can figure out how to do that, then maybe all the other kilowatt hours are 20 cents as well. But starting with 20 cents for heat pumps and EVs means that it's kind of a no-brainer to go that way. And for climate, we don't have the time for it not to be a no-brainer. Someone asked the question or made the comment that we need a certain amount of rate of people putting in heat pumps and EVs in order to solve climate change. And that number is like 4 or 5% a year. And we're not doing anywhere near that right now. We have to do something with these kind of rates to encourage that percentage of the public to every year switch over to heat pumps and EVs.
Ellen, why don't you go ahead?
What's the story on storage, electric storage technology? I mean, I know of places that have tried to build battery storage devices, and you have those available. I mean, not just the batteries in electric buses.
Well, batteries in electric cars, I think, is the most important one for our conversation. Yeah, there are grid batteries and things that are also talked about with thermal storage with heat pumps, but batteries come with electric cars, and one of the things that's nice about a battery, and electric car vehicle manufacturers are starting to realize it's a selling point, is that if the power goes out in your house, you can run for a good long time on a 80 kilowatt hour battery that's sitting plugged in. So putting those vehicles in a way and having the systems in your house, so if the power goes out, your house can use the electric vehicle battery, is something that people want, rather than getting a backup generator for an important outage. And so there's a draw from consumers to buy it. Now the question is, can we use that battery to also help the grid? Can we instead use that battery to not only not be on when the grid peaks at the head of the duct, but actually to either provide electricity to the grid or to take your house offline for a few hours, as it's now automatically set up to do, and help the grid in return for a pretty good sized check, because that can be a lot of money as compared with the grid building out this double-sized system.
I have solar panels, and I thought, oh, well, it's a power outage, I'll still have power. No, the power from my solar panels goes somewhere into the grid, and I don't know.
Well, ultimately, it'd be good to be able to have it go into your own battery or your own vehicle. So let's see what happens for now. But it's good that you have solar and it's going into the grid.
Okay, I just want to say this has been fantastic. Thank you so much, Harvey, for bringing your cumulative expertise, ongoing expertise. It's fantastic. So I just have one comment. JCAN, as I said, is about action. We have been promoting electrification, decarbonization, and I appreciate that what you're saying is that we need running. We need people to be running towards these technologies faster and faster. And your proposals will move us in that direction. great, great, great. And how quickly can we do that is a subject for another session. How quickly we're going to get from here to there. But my one little question for the moment is just about the concept of break even. You said at the rates that we generally are paying, we're right around break even for heat pumps in many, many cases. And I just want to mention that that's and this what I want to check with you. That's not coincidence. That, as I understand it, that's how incentives have been set, so that uh, not to force the market, but to allow the market to move. Now, I'd rather the market have more pressure on it, but in the meantime, that's my understanding of the rationale of the incentives at break even. So, do you have any thoughts about that? Am I right about the rationale that the incentives are at break?
I think we both have history, Fred, of incentives from mass save and whatever that took something that was actually better than break even to begin with, and then basically created a blow the doors off price for it, like LED bulbs. And it got to the point pretty quickly that you realized, yeah, I could pay $10 or $15 for this bulb and it still would be a good deal. But the fact that it's $3, let me load up. And so, or if you do a mass save energy audit, $0. They put all the bulbs in your home for free. And when you do an audit as essentially a thank you for doing it. I think that's important in order to get us
Actually,
going fast enough. That's what I think.
Sorry, lighting is a fascinating example because today incandescent light bulbs are not on the market. So what are the utilities replacing is a very good question now.
Well,
so in other words,
congratulations, Fred. You're in this business and you got there. So let's say heat pumps and EVs,
Yeah, just mandate.
Well, that's the issue, right? You mandate, and then what happens next? It could be that if people don't feel like they want to, there's not a strong enough compelling argument, and we do something with prohibitions or mandates. People still vote, and that's my concern. We have to solve climate change. I think having people run towards it because the value is so great for the 2/3 of the public that aren't ready to do it because it's just the right thing to do is important.
We're running out of time, so I'm going to give Robert a chance to speak, and then Harvey and Fred, you can just give us your really quick takeaways, and because we only have 2 minutes left. Go ahead, Robert.
Sure, just very quick. So you're proposing a 20-cent rate, 20 cents an hour rate for heat pumps. Is that true during like a winter peaking event, or do you do something different during those periods?
Right. You have to avoid the peak. The problem with heat pumps is if you do the mass save design for $10,000 and you have a typical older home, the odds are on average you use 3 kilowatts of load for your heat pump, but on that peak hour, if you just do it that way, you could be using 12 to 15 kilowatts of load. We run out of load in a hurry in New England if people use that much. People who have hybrid heat pumps use 0 at that time. Maine does 5% a year and uses almost 0 on those peak hours. That's a great solution from the standpoint.
Harvey, I think you need to explain to everyone what you mean by a hybrid heat pump.
Yeah, so basically what is typical, what Maine is shooting for everybody doing is putting a heat pump that runs down to 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and people use their legacy system below that. And it ends up being a solution that works well in the program that they have and the way that it's designed. And there's very little heat pump on during the peak load event. I don't have a problem with an efficient home with a heat pump that's only 2 or 3 kilowatts. I certainly don't have a problem with a home with a ground source heat pump. It's going to even be less than that. The problem is if someone has an air source heat pump with electric resistance backup, that's the thing that we don't give a discount for on rates, because if anything, they deserve a higher rate, but let's at least charge them the same rate as they're charging now.
Okay, we need to wrap up. Fred suggested that we give Mark Dian the last word. Mark, do you have anything to you want to say to wrap things up?
I guess I'll say two things. One is that what is being laid out is a different perspective on how we move from where we are to where we need to be in terms of electrification. That is to set it, rather than trying to figure out how we bribe people into doing something that they don't want to do. How do we set up the rates so that they want to do what is needed? That's the first thing, and that's a significant change in the way Mass Save and sort of the operates, and in the way the sort of structure around Mass Save is set up. The internal rewards and punishments for the utilities for achievement tilt them towards the system that we've got, and so it'll be a big change there. That's one. The second thing, the good news is, when Harvey said we need to do 4 or 5% changeover every year, that's about the rate at which heat pumps, about at which central air conditioners and furnaces fail every year. Those things last 15 to 20 years. Do the math. If we could get most of the people at the time that their system fails to go with the right kind of system, this could be relatively painless. So I think that conceptual change and this mathematical one that's there are the framework into which the what I call the Harvey Michaels approach is going to fit, and is going to make a big difference in how fast we get to where we need to be with a zero emission economy. So that's my positive takeaway from this discussion.
All right. Thank you, Mark. I want to thank everybody from JCAN, from the program committee, from the Legs and Regs committee. We've been fortunate to hear from Harvey and Mark every Monday morning, and grateful that they were able to share their knowledge with the broader community today. So, and especially thank you to Thea for hosting, and to Harvey for your wonderful presentation. People are asking if it's recorded, and presentation and the slides are available later. It was recorded, and so anybody who registered will get an email, I assume, from Thea that will give them the link to see the recording. So thank you for hanging in on this Monday night. I appreciate it.
Thank you, folks. I enjoyed it.